Hey, welcome back to the Friday Show, brought to you this week by Woodbine. And I sure hope you caught some of the exciting racing action north of the border last weekend with the Woodbine Oaks, the plate trial, some other graded stakes, and there's graded stakes action this weekend as well at Woodbine. I'm Ray Pollock, joined by Bloodstock editor Joe Nevels, and our guest this week, Kyle McDoniel, recently was named president and COO of Equibase, the Thoroughbred Industries official database. Kyle, welcome to the Friday Show.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you very much for having me. I'm been looking forward to this, and hopefully we can cover some interesting topics.
So I know you came to Equibase from the sports, the non-racing sports world, but I understand that you kind of grew up as a fan of racing in Arkansas, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. That's right. I've always been a sports guy, and part of that was back as a kid, reading the Arkansas Democrat and Randy Moss, and looking at the Oaklawn results and entries, and getting the picks from Randy Moss. And then as I got a little older, I was able to go down to the track on a regular basis. And I've been fortunate enough; I still have family there, and still usually get back to Oaklawn at least once a year. Love the facility and the feel of the place, and it's been something that I've been a fan of racing my entire life as I've moved around my different roles, whether it was in Seattle when I first started with ESPN. We would go down to Emerald Downs. I would when we moved to Connecticut, we would in the summers go over, and the kids were little, so spend some time out in the picnic grounds at Saratoga. And then most recently, I've been out in LA, and so love to get down to Del Mar, which I was there this weekend, so it's just a lot of fun, and look forward to seeing a lot more tracks.
Mm-hmm. So as Ray mentioned, you have a sports background. How are you bringing that experience and sort of what you've seen in sort of other realms into the horse racing position that you have now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I have really worked in sports and sports data my entire career. I started early on at ESPN.com. Prior to that, I was a newspaper writer for a few years, but really was in on the early days of ESPN.com. And then we also did the official websites for the NBA, for the NFL, and for NASCAR. And so I actually started working out on the league property side of the business, worked really closely with NASCAR, in their timing and scoring. And then just throughout my entire career, I've worked with sports data, whether it was ESPN fantasy games. I ran that group for a while, and have really been able to touch a lot of different sports. But really, this is the first time that I've worked in a professional role in the horse racing industry. And so as a fan, I'm excited to try and bring a lot of the things that we've been able to do, whether it was figuring out how to engage fans better on social media. Most recently, I've worked a lot in the sports betting realm with Sportradar, and where we collect and distribute data from all the major sporting leagues around the world, and then distribute that out to all the major sportsbook operators around the world. So it's I think there are a lot of similarities in what the data sets look like, how those data sets are consumed, and I think we can build a lot of products that really can start to engage new racing fans and bring more people into the sport, and also ride on some of the coattails of the growth of sports betting here in the U.S. as well.
So you mentioned some of the other sports and the data that they collect. Equibase is a joint venture of the Jockey Club and something called the Thoroughbred Racing Association of North America, which is, as far as I know, doesn't really have a major function anymore other than being part owner of Equibase. So Equibase pays to collect the data. How does the data in other sports get collected? The baseball and NASCAR, football, all that. Does the industry pay to collect the data, or who actually does that?
Yeah, so it happens in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of third parties that will be involved in the collection of the data. But then that's typically, financed by the leagues, and then offset by their, by the television contracts primarily. But for example, in my in my roles, like in fantasy games, for example, all the data that drives fantasy games, even though it's publicly available data, we're paying services, whether it's like Sportradar, back in the day, StatSync, on how to get that data in, make sure it's reliable, make sure it's in the format we need, et cetera.
Is there a specific innovation in any of the recent, a recent innovation in a different sport that you'd be interested to see applied into horse racing?
So there are a lot. I think one of the things that I found really interesting, as you think about how sports betting has evolved in the U.S., is during the pandemic and now even past the pandemic, you've seen an incredible amount of betting action on table tennis. And to the point, even in Colorado last year when the Avalanche won the Stanley Cup, the handle for table tennis was higher in Colorado than the handle for NHL in that month. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into that, right? Given that just from a volume perspective, right? But I think I look at horse racing, and I see a product that has lots of great video content. I see a product that has footprint across the U.S. and across the world, and I see just a tremendous amount of betting opportunities, right? And so I think to figure out, and it was interesting. I was actually had FanDuel TV on earlier today, and one of the hosts was equating speed figures with pitchers' ERA, right? And so I really love to see a lot of the things that they're doing to really help getting people who are maybe not regular horse racing fans and horse racing bettors to really start to consider that as a part of kind of their day-to-day entertainment. And so I think those are some of the things that I've really enjoyed seeing. But I think as far as other innovations, prior to coming here at Sportradar, I worked really closely with the NBA on helping implement their new optical tracking data, and so they're gathering data from optical tracking sensors and cameras that are all around the arena, and so as a result, they're able to use that from an officiating standpoint. They're able to use that to, track players down to the fingertip. They're able to track the ball rotation. And so there's just so many things that can be done. And then I think as we gather those deeper and deeper sets of data, there are going to be a lot of additional products we can create, both for the serious handicapper as well as for, as well as for the more casual fan. And so that's really kind of how we're thinking about it.
The elephant in the room with Equibase compared to other sports seems to be that so much of what Equibase produces is sold to the consumer. You had mentioned that in other sports, the data may be sold by the league to the businesses who then distribute it to the consumer. How do you get around that? And is part of your mission as the new president of Equibase to be profitable, or to expand the game through more wagering and more interactions with fans?
Yeah, look, I think obviously it's there are costs associated with collecting this data, and the better data we collect and the more technology we bring into the equation, there's always a cost associated with that. But I really think of this as what are the things that we can do to make sure that we're bringing in the data that we need to grow the sport. And then we're going to be constantly evaluating the business models around that, and how we can all work together as an industry to improve what we're doing. And so I think you've probably seen there's more data I think available on Equibase for free than there has in the past. I think where that line goes, we're continually going to kind of evaluate and think about. And then as we bring new products online and things we can distribute via social media, things that are going to work really well with our television partners and the television partners with the tracks. There's a lot of room to grow, and I think what you look at today is not necessarily how things are going to look at it in the future. At the same time, I've started on June 1st, and so really still in the process of kind of taking in a lot of different inputs, evaluating kind of where things want to go and where we want to invest. But it's an exciting opportunity for sure.
You mentioned data collection, and that was kind of interesting to me. You mentioned the optic things with the NBA, and for the most part, pretty much every NBA stadium, you're going to be able to rig up with what you need. Some are going to be nicer than others, but there's sort of there's a basement level of quality and ability access of everything. But for horse racing, whether it's in terms of manpower, facilities, what have you, there's a big difference between Belmont Park and the Elko County Fair, where Equibase is collecting data on both of them. What are some of the sort of similarities, differences, challenges between sort of the spectrum of tracks where you have to collect data from?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been a little bit enlightening to me, and in my first few weeks here, I have gone out to Ellis Park to meet the team there, and walk the grounds. Did the same out at Del Mar, to really understand all the different pieces of the infrastructure, all the different people who are working, at the track, and how they touch data collection in different ways. And it's no small undertaking, and there are a lot of variables. I think you factor in one, how these tracks are, right? Like it's a wiring and other things are expensive to run for those sorts of distances. They're prone to any number of things going wrong, either from a weather perspective or from a track operations perspective, whatever. There are just a lot of different things that can happen. And so making sure that we have resilient systems, making sure that we have systems that are cost effective, are all a big part of that. I think it's encouraging to me that as you see technology get better and better, you also, in a lot of times, have seen prices, also come down over time as well. And so I'm really hopeful that, as sort of technology continues to improve, as the costs continue to drop on some of these things, it'll help us justify a much greater data infrastructure around these tracks, which certainly just a lot of physical area to cover.
Kyle, I know you're going to be making a presentation at the Jockey Club Roundtable on August 3rd, where you may be discussing the timing system that's in place at a lot of tracks, which is GPS. I don't know if it's still a blend of GPS and traditional timing.
That's right. Yep.
But is the future of charting the races, the data that goes into the past performances, the points of call, is the future of that in GPS?
Yeah, so look, the GPS is definitely a big component of the future, and I think one of the things that we're looking at, and we have some active testing going on right now around bringing in multiple inputs that help supplement the GPS, that help us recognize if there are any potential errors in the GPS signals, so that we're able to smooth that data out and get a very accurate representation of what's going on. And so I think you'll see a lot of improvements in that over the next year, which will, I think, markedly change, how you can look at, how you can look at the race from a GPS perspective, how it played out over time, every horse's position, every horse relative to one another, where they're at. And so I think all those things are coming. I do think there's still a lot that happens from a chart calling perspective that XY coordinates aren't necessarily going to capture. And so I think it's going to be a mix of those things. I think, I'm also hopeful that we can continue to build out the camera infrastructure, figure out, ways to use drones and other views of the race that will help us continue to improve the level of the data we get, as well as give us more flexibility on sort of how and where it's collected.
Just a footnote to that. A lot of people don't realize that the points of call that show up in a past performance line are traditionally have been compiled by somebody standing up in the press box with a pair of binoculars, reading into a tape recorder or giving it to a call taker. And some chart callers are very accurate and some are new at it and not as good, but that's how the data is collected. So
it not necessarily a foolproof system, right? And so I think what we're trying to do is get it to the point where we have enough disparate inputs that we can check against one another, and then make sure that we get there. And then the other thing that is maybe less obvious too, right, is as a turf rail gets moved in and out, like that changes the timing, changes circumference. And so I think those are things where I think maybe in the past have been overlooked to some extent. And so, we want to make sure, and we actually think the GPS technology does a lot to really, over time, give you a completely accurate picture of a race from every dimension.
Mm-hmm. Joe?
So more and more, and I mean, this goes on for past years going into the future, people are using their phones a lot more to watch races, handicap races, and PDFs can be very difficult to read on a phone. When it comes to producing past performances or race charts, is there work being done to make those a little more phone friendly?
I mean, back when I first started, looking at charts, at the track at Oaklawn, I didn't need glasses to look at them, and they were on newsprint, right? Now it's a much different story, and everybody has a mobile device, and I do think that there's a lot that we need to think about with respect to how people consume PPs and how do we make that easier. We have a product, Race Lens, that I've been super impressed with. Just at the both sort of the ability to use it from a mobile perspective, the ability to just really look at things from a lot of different angles. But I think there's so much more that can be done from a presentation standpoint, and I think that's just going to take continual product work and fine tuning and understanding how people are actually using our products and setting things up in a way that they're easy to consume.
So I think Equibase also does the collection of wagering data. Have you had a chance to look at how that's collected and whether or not there's a better way to present it? Some of the one of the big talking points, and it's going to be discussed at the roundtable, are the computer-assisted wagering teams. And so a dollar bet with somebody representing those computer-assisted wagering groups is different than a dollar bet on track. Is there ever going to be a way to better track, better compile the data on wagering, which is sort of the lifeblood traditionally of the industry? Now that we have casinos and slot revenue, it's a little bit different. But the collection of wagering data seems to be something that's just kind of not really evolved in a positive way.
Yeah, that would certainly be something I'll be looking at down the road. I think a lot of that obviously is reliant on the tote companies and how that data gets collected and in what format that it can be delivered. And so from my perspective, I think you mentioned the computer assisted wagering, right? And when I was at Yahoo Sports, and one of the areas that I oversaw was our daily fantasy, right? And I don't know how familiar you guys are with kind of the daily fantasy world, which was essentially how DraftKings and FanDuel got their foothold in the U.S. before PASPA being repealed and sports betting starting to be widely regulated here. But long story short is that those markets were really challenged, right? Because there were a significant number of whales or sharks in that environment, and it made it really difficult for the casual player to win. And so I think everybody wants to feel like you've got a fair chance to win, and maybe know something that somebody else doesn't. And so that's the appeal of a lot of the things that we all do, whether it's fantasy football, whether it's daily fantasy, whether it's horse racing. Like, you want to show that you know something that somebody else doesn't, and if there's a financial upside to it, all the better, right? And so I think all those things need to be taken into consideration as we look toward the future of the sport, and give everybody a better understanding of exactly what's happening.
Now, you started in this position on June 1st, correct?
That's right.
So we're just about to end month 2 as the head of Equibase. I know that you've had a lot of experience with the races. You mentioned that you've been going to Oaklawn for a long time, all the different points you've hit. But what is something that you've learned about either the horse racing industry or Equibase as a company since you've sort of been in the position that you are now in the last 2 months? What's something that's sort of been revealed to you that you might not have necessarily expected to be revealed?
One of the things that I've really tried to spend a lot of time getting a better understanding of is because I felt like I understood, a lot of the wagering and past performance and some of those things, at least at a reasonable level. But what I've really tried to understand are the economics of, the thoroughbred industry overall, from the owner's perspective, from the trainer's perspective, from the breeder's perspective, and really, think about how that just works with the business. And so, I one of the things that I think when I, first read through the McKinsey report, that was done a while back, and it was eye-opening to me that, and I guess it just because I've never really thought of it, but, your typical Kentucky Derby winner runs 6, 7, 8 times in their career, right? Which makes it really hard to, develop kind of long-term following. And so I think that's another thing that, I want to think about what we can do from a data perspective is, even for horses that have a short career, how do we really put an exclamation point around the around like flight line, right, and get it in a public consciousness in a way that people really feel like that this is something that they have to see, because I do think that and listen, the economics make all the sense in the world why that's the case, that these horses don't stay on the track longer. That said, I think for the casual fan, to give them something more to follow in the sport will help draw people in more over time.
Well, Kyle, appreciate you taking the time. Wish you good luck in your new position at Equibase. We'll be listening for you at the Jockey Club Roundtable on August 3rd. And again, wishing you all the best. It's the place where all of the data that we rely on starts. And without Equibase, we would be in the dark.
Well, thank you, Ray. I really appreciate it. Joe, appreciate you as well. And it's been really a great couple of months to start here, and to see sort of what we have at Equibase and where we can grow from here is really exciting. So thank you both again.
All right. Well, that does it for this week's Friday show. We'll see you next week.
Support award-winning independent horse industry journalism and become a Pollock Report Insider on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, insiders get access to exclusive Q&As with Pollock Report staff, insight behind our editorial process, exclusive opinions and on-site analysis, Pollock Report merch, and more. This is not a paywall. The website you know and love will always be the same. But if you want more, and you want to make our coverage even better, visit patreon.com/Pollock Report and become a Pollock Report Insider today.